The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Over the last year and a half to 2 years, we've seen a real resurgence of pseudo-intellectual thinking, especially led by this internet movement that I think people who watch this show are sort of familiar with. And there was an article in the New York Times recently by Barry Weiss that has gotten a lot of attention, writing about what some are calling the intellectual dark web. And I didn't agree with nearly everything that she wrote in the piece, but she does do an interesting job of exposing people to the fact that this movement exists. I guess maybe movement is the word. I don't even know if we can really call it a movement. And explaining to people sort of some of the players involved and some of the ideology involved. And I don't even really know exactly who's part of this movement. The article in the Times talked about Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Eric Weinstein, Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro. A lot of different people were mentioned. And most of the people described in the article are certainly not intellectuals by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that the more interesting part is less about the intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals themselves and more about why they are increasingly, why there is a group that is increasingly attracted to those types of characters. And as I've said before, and we've talked about pseudo-intellectualism a lot on the program, to really fight back against pseudo-intellectualism, you have to understand the two sides of the problem. And in the New York Times article and elsewhere, some of the people I mentioned will ascribe to their followers a desire for truth and truly open debate about all ideas with no taboo topics as the reason for their success, right? Their story is people are so starved for real discussion about real issues because of the repression of the liberal media and political correctness, and sometimes they blame postmodernism, that there was just this overwhelming pent-up demand for exactly what these intellectual dark webbers, or whatever you want to call them, are offering. Now, I completely disagree, and it's a two-part issue as to how it all happened. The first part is, why do we have a population that's particularly receptive right now to pseudo-intellectual ideas that can sometimes sound unique and correct and accurate? And then part two is the sort of inability to distinguish between real intellectual thought, real critical thinking, real seeing of knowledge or seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge versus just pseudo-intellectual nonsense that sounds pretty good without really saying anything unique or even in many cases substantive. So let's start with part one, the environment. I've spoken about that quite a bit. There are people right now who feel disaffected, either economically, socially, or intellectually. They feel as though whatever real or perceived status they have may be on the brink of going away, and they have been primed to accept faux intellectual nonsense that seems to explain why it is that they're experiencing what they're experiencing, and maybe even present some ideas as to how they might be able to stop it or fix the problem they see. They've been conditioned that academia is just liberal indoctrination and bad, or that actual intellectualism is bad, that they won't get the real truth because of censorship and political correctness and all of that stuff. And that view exists more on the right, but not exclusively. There are left-wing elements to this as well, for sure. There are people on the left who have also fallen for movements like men's rights activism, that they won't get the truth about the oppression of men because evil feminists won't allow the truth to come out, or SJWs or whoever. Then there's the question of, aside from being primed for pseudo-intellectual answers to why the world is the way it is, why do they fall for the faux intellectual nonsense specifically from some of the people we're now seeing? And a lot of it is presentation style, right? It's how people speak. It's marketing, period. They hear the seemingly esoteric language, but they understand it. Because the truth is what these people are selling, and it's not actually difficult to understand for them. The truth is it's not unique or notable either, but it's very appealing. The desire for the feeling of authority that knowing the real truth brings to them is a big tractor beam, to borrow a phrase from Star Wars. And they heard from someone who's managed to get around censorship that these are the people that are going to tell you the real truth with no political correctness getting in the way. And a lack of context is often what makes the faux intellectual nonsense effective, right? People hear ideas that sound good enough, and they're different than what they've been told before, so they buy it without considering the real implications of those ideas in the real world. And in the end, there's a lot about simply people that command authority as a factor here, right? Sometimes it's people that speak quickly, like Ben Shapiro, or loudly or eloquently, like Jordan Peterson, or whatever, right? That's a huge factor, the optics of the presentation. And that's actually a really similar mechanism as to what's at play within the world of pseudoscience, which we'll be dealing with in a mini-series soon. But there's also some overlap with conspiracy theories. I've explained before that with conspiracy theories, the appeal is sometimes simple and neat explanations, which, even if untrue, are more comforting than the truth, which is often some version of the world is a gray area of unpredictability, period, right? So I'll give you an example to illustrate the point from the conspiracy world. Rather than we were attacked by people on 9/11 and we either couldn't or didn't stop it, and people randomly died. It was a tragedy with a huge random element to it. It's more comforting to some to believe that 9/11 was controlled and planned, maybe even by people in our government, maybe George W. Bush, combined with the World Trade Center that was painted with thermite. The walls were painted with thermite paint for years to make the building catch on fire more easily. And the analogy with pseudo-intellectualism is, for example, take the race and IQ discussion, which has become very popular. Rather than recognizing and evaluating the multi-generational socioeconomic issues that on a test like IQ lead to what appear to be correlations of race and IQ, so on and so forth. Instead, how about some races are just smarter, period, inherently, right? Or another example from the so-called intellectual dark web. There are real differences between men and women. That's a popular one. Yeah, does anybody deny that? That's not original. That's what really gets to me about the so-called intellectual dark web. I've heard nothing unique from any of them. And I mean, looking at their full range of topics, Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. Wow. Wait a second. You go back and you read How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie from 1936, and his book is filled with the exact same idea. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves. Let the other person do a great deal of the talking. Try to honestly see things from the other person's point of view. There's nothing even remotely notable about Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life or for Life or whatever. Another example is the idea around free speech and censorship, right? There are a lot of people activated by this intellectual dark web movement because they feel like they can't say what they want to anymore. There's nothing remarkable about that. I grew up around people like that, the sort of Hilltown folks from around the Northampton, Massachusetts area. They believe that the political correctness of the college towns in the Pioneer Valley were suffocating them and preventing them from saying what they wanted to say, although it was never really clear what it was they wanted to say that they actually couldn't say. That's not unique. It's not new. It's not even notable in any way. Or free speech as a meta issue that trumps all other issues. That's another calling card of the intellectual dark web. Anyone who has thought about meta issues in political and economic society almost always includes the role of speech at the top of the list. I include it along with how politics are financed, the media world, and our economic system. Those are the meta issues. There's nothing unique or notable there. Let's take a more specific example. One of the sort of common ideas that I'm seeing on the intellectual dark web is ideas around taxation, right? Where what we have is unfair, it punishes success, and you end up with some version of a flat tax or a semi-flat tax that's getting presented now as some kind of compromise between who knows what arbitrary positions on either side. Flat taxes have been floating around forever, right? It's not unique, it's not new, it's not even remotely interesting. And that is why it is abundantly clear that the entire intellectual dark web movement is not an intellectual movement. It's a movement around marketing and presentation style combined with using the internet and social media, period. That is all. There's nothing unique, period. And the solution, sadly, is not real intellectuals, right? If you think that real intellectuals will solve the problem of pseudo-intellectualism, that's like thinking, if I just explain the facts about gay marriage to my homophobic cousin, he'll immediately change his mind. We actually know that the opposite is often true. Being presented with information that seeks to disprove or contradict your worldview or understanding of the world will often just further ingrain you in those beliefs. The real problem is the environment in which the faux intellectual nonsense of these people is not only able to take hold, but actually welcomed with open arms, as I described earlier in this discussion. And that's what I don't know how to change. The faux intellectuals, the intellectual dark web, and all of that stuff is a consequence of the problem that we have in society, which I've identified for a long time in many conversations about both anti-intellectualism and pseudo-intellectualism. So send me your thoughts about how I've laid this out. If I'm wrong, change my mind. Tell me what unique or notable ideas are actually coming out of the so-called intellectual dark web. I'm on Twitter at dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Daniel Brunk. Daniel, thank you. Thank you for being a new member who joined at joinpakman.com. Also want to thank our long-term sustaining member, Daniel Henriksen, who's been with us since 2012. A new Daniel and a not-so-new Daniel. Thanks to both of you. And I do have 4. Yesterday I told you that Tom Baker, in the wake of the Coinbase hack, got in touch and said, David, I want to sponsor half of 15 memberships. 11 of those 15 memberships have been spoken for. They've been scooped up. I've got 4 left, okay? So if you want a half-price membership, thanks to Tom Baker, you can keep the discount as long as you want. Get in touch by using the contact form at davidpakman.com. Some of you may have noticed that today I am wearing a T-shirt, a very stable Genius T-shirt with original Trump cartoon artwork. Some of you may have noticed that Pat is wearing also a T-shirt, and maybe you can back up a hair, Pat, which back up just a tiny bit there. There we go, where you can see Donald Trump's Donald Trump's hair. I mean, that was a genuine Freudian slip, which says this thing called nuclear weapons, like lots of things are done with uranium, including some bad things. And I also have here in front of me another example T-shirt, which is Trump smiling with the quote, "If Ivanka weren't my daughter," which I think we can all remember from actually many, many times during Donald Trump's life, sadly. These are all new T-shirt designs submitted by the audience, including the great Florian Bunz, who has been working with us for a long time. And these are available at davidpakman.com/gear, and people are loving these things. They're all available in a ton of different colors. We are going to continue adding more designs, but these are conversation starters.
Oh, yeah.
To call them anything.
They're very fun. They include the audience. And, of course, we still have the David Pakman Show logo apparel.
Of course.
The Patriot Mail apparel. We have the coffee. I mean, there's a lot at that website.
The coffee and Cobfeffi, both available at davidpakman.com/gear. Yeah, so check out the new T-shirts. We've got this thing called Nuclear Weapons T-shirt. We've got the Very Stable Genius T-shirt. We've got the If Ivanka Weren't My Daughter T-shirt, plus the Established in 2005, Patriot Mail logo T-shirt. It's amazing what's going on, and now all of these are printed in a different way than our old T-shirts,
Yeah.
so the graphics really pop in a way that they never used to.
I was practicing my catwalk all morning, like as a way to model this.
What is a catwalk exactly?
It's like when you walk down and
like a runway.
show it off. Right, yeah, like a runway.
Okay. Yeah.
But maybe we can do that on the bonus show.
Yeah, I would not. I've got a message from the management of the building, and because I guess you were doing it out in front of, literally in front of the building, and at a time when people were showing up to work, and it was causing a lot of concern, and I had to basically, let's just say I've had to negotiate not us getting kicked out of our lease. So thanks, Pat, for that. But yeah, the T-shirts attract a lot of attention as Pat clearly demonstrated this morning. DavidPakman.com/gear. Hey, remember when China was bad, according to Donald Trump? China was taking advantage of us. China was killing us on trade deals. China deserved to be tariffed and taxed and sanctioned and all of that stuff. They must be punished for taking our jobs, and we're going to change the geopolitics around China and start winning again, because we never used to win. We used to, but we aren't winning anymore, or something. Remember Trump's obsession during the campaign with China? Remember this?
Let's say China.
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 China. China. You go over to China. 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 You take China.
China.
China. I love them. China. 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 I have to have my China.
So all of a sudden, Donald Trump wants to help China get jobs back. And when I read the headline, I thought, this must be a fake headline. There's no way that Trump is now saying, let me help China create jobs. And of course, like most headlines about Donald Trump, it's true. And we've now found out that not only is the headline true, it coincides with news of a $500 million contribution from China to a Trump-linked project in Indonesia, from which Trump and his family will make money. And this goes back to American sanctions of a Chinese company called ZTE, which was fined for selling illegally to Iran and North Korea. U.S. regulators found out that the company didn't correct their violation, so they blocked American suppliers from selling parts to ZTE. And Trump says, not winning, no. He says the penalty is too harsh. We need to help the Chinese company get more jobs. Tweeting the other day, President Xi of China and I are working together to give massive Chinese phone company ZTE a way to get back into business fast. Too many jobs in China lost. Commerce Department has been instructed to get it done. And just as this very confusing and contradictory position on Chinese jobs went public, we also learned that the Chinese government is going to give a $500 million loan to a state-owned construction company to build an Indonesian theme park featuring none other than a series of Trump-branded golf courses and hotels. Trump is literally saying that a company that was stealing the intellectual property of American companies and was sanctioned because of their sale of product to Iran was punished too harshly, and we need to help recover Chinese jobs. It is difficult to put into words how the coming together of these events, the Chinese government's loan to an Indonesian Trump-linked resort, and Trump's sudden desire to help China create jobs, represent the full and total bamboozling of the American people that is the Trump presidency, because this is so brazen that even the stalwart conservative publication National Review is reporting about this. And as usual, the defenders say exactly what you would expect them to say. Trump has no involvement in the operation of that resort. Okay, but he's aware it exists. Trump won't own the resort. It's just being branded Trump. Yes, for which the Trump organization receives money. They will say the loan has nothing to do with Trump's position on Chinese jobs. Maybe so, but isn't it yet another one of those disgusting swamp-filling coincidences? And I want to go back for a second to the sanctions part. The sanctions are meted out by the U.S. Department of Commerce. Trump going on Twitter and saying he's simply going to interfere with the Department of Commerce to change the punishment is also a major threat to the integrity of corporate law enforcement, which is effectively what this is. So the immediate questions which have been put together by Public Citizen, how does this not violate the emoluments clause, aside from the Chinese jobs element? When did Trump become aware of the anticipated $500 million Chinese loan to the Indonesian resort project? Have Trump and the Chinese president discussed the loan to the Indonesian resort project? And has it been discussed at any other government level? And in the end, remember, Trump said there would be no new foreign deals by his company during his presidency. That is another direct lie which has been broken. And then finally, let's go full circle back to the Steele dossier, right? The Trump-Russia dossier. One of the things that the dossier says is, quote, suggestion from source close to Trump and Manafort that Republican campaign team is happy to have Russia as a media bogeyman to mask more extensive corrupt business ties to China and other emerging countries. Is this yet another element of the Steele dossier that is being proven true? Certainly seems like it. And Republicans, I'm ready. I am ready for you to become the party of law and order and the Constitution and all that is good in the world. Call this out. Call for an investigation into this. And that's at least what a couple of reporters did with Raj Shah yesterday. So let's reset a little bit as we transition to Raj Shah. I already spoke earlier in the show about how Donald Trump is now very interested in helping China regain jobs, when I thought the goal was to get jobs back from China for Trump. And it seems to coincide with the news of a $500 million contribution, a loan effectively, from China to an Indonesian Trump-linked resort. Well, the White House was asked about it, as they should have been. Sarah Huckabee Sanders apparently off yesterday. Deputy Press Secretary Raj Shah ran yesterday's press conference, and he was asked a very simple question, which is a question that has been suggested many times in the last 24 hours, which is, how does this not violate the emoluments clause of the Constitution? It is the president's business getting something of value from a foreign government. Raj Shah wouldn't answer it, and it's hard to imagine how he even could answer it. Let's check out the video.
The Trump Organization is involved in a project in Indonesia, building hotels, golf course residences. It's getting up to $500 million in backing from the Chinese government. Can you tell or explain the administration's perspective on A, how this wouldn't violate the emoluments clause, and B, how it wouldn't violate the president's own promise that his private organization would not be getting involved in new foreign deals while he was president?
I'll have to refer you to the Trump Organization.
No, but I mean, the Trump Organization can't speak on behalf of the president as the president, the head of the federal government, the one who's responsible, who needs to assure the American people.
And
they don't have that responsibility.
But you're asking about a private organization's dealings that may have to do with a foreign government. That's not something that I can speak to.
So the entire premise of the answer is nonsense, right? Raj Shah says we can't speak on the behalf of the Trump Organization. We're not talking about the Trump Organization. We're talking about, number one, the promise that candidate Trump made that as President Trump, he would not be involved in any foreign deals. That relates to the president. We're also talking about the president receiving something of value from a foreign country, seemingly a violation of the emoluments clause. If you went to the Trump Organization and asked them, they'd correctly say, we're just a private company. The emoluments clause applies to government officials. Talk to someone who represents Trump as a government official. And the one thing that Raj Shah's answer does sort of illuminate is that there's a question at this point as to whether there really is separation between President Trump and Trump, the CEO of the Trump Organization, right? The guy hasn't divested from his businesses. He continues to be aware of their business activity and deals. He continues to benefit from them. So really, it's almost like there is no difference. And Raj Shah is either actually ignorant or just playing stupid about the fact that Trump as president is very involved with the business of the Trump Organization. So even taken at face value, the statement by Raj Shah makes no sense. If Shah's answer is this has to do with the Trump Organization and not President Trump, the immediate next question should be, well, does President Trump still have a financial interest in the Trump Organization, or did he divest? And obviously Shah's answer would be, you'd have to talk to his personal attorney, who at this point, by the way, is in no position to really be answering any questions dealing with the potential indictment himself and Michael Cohen. This is the same strategy that was employed by Sarah Huckabee Sanders earlier this month. Remember this?
I just wanted to ask you about something that took place last week involving the president's personal attorney, Michael Cohen. He, in court documents, asserted that he would assert his Fifth Amendment rights in the Stormy Daniels lawsuit, which was filed against both him and the president. And you may recall that in September of 2017, the president at a campaign rally said, the mob takes the Fifth. And he also said, if you're innocent, why are you taking the Fifth Amendment? Do those ideas also apply to Michael Cohen? Does the president stand by those comments?
I can't speak on behalf of Michael Cohen. I'd refer you to him, Francesca.
It is disgusting that they get away with this. And during the same briefing, Raj Shah was asked, why the hell is Trump tweeting support for specific Chinese companies and what led up to that? Also no answer from Raj about that.
Yes, Sarah.
So I have two questions for you. First on ZTE. Did the Chinese government give any specific concession for the President of the United States to tweet in support of a Chinese company?
No, the President has asked Secretary Ross to look into the matter, consistent with...
Why did he do that?
The issue has been raised at many levels by the Chinese government with various levels of our administration.
Just raising the issue was enough to spawn a presidential tweet?
It's a significant issue of concern of the Chinese government, and in our bilateral relationship, there's a give and take, and we discuss these issues.
This is what needs to be immediately shut down and investigated if Democrats do well in the November midterms. And Pat, we've been talking about the multiple prongs of Mueller's investigation, right? We've got Trump-Russia, we've got obstruction and possible crimes, witness tampering in the covering up of attempts to stop Trump-Russia, and then financial crimes of a sort of pretty specific nature. Mueller's not looking into the emoluments clause thing, to the best of my knowledge. We need to vote in November because the concerns around constitutional violations are massive, growing, and presumably outside of Mueller's scope.
Yeah, and even if something's outside of Mueller's purview, he can always delegate that responsibility off to someone else, like send it to an attorney general in another state. So we have seen that, and I think we'll continue to see that.
Yeah, of course, the complexity specifically when it's emoluments is you're talking about the federal constitution. So then it becomes dubious to send it to a state attorney general. That is something that at the federal level must be looked into. It's disgusting. It is swamp filling. And we may have a president here who has indeed violated the Constitution. Discuss this with us on Reddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Quick break, back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Glen Weyl, who's the principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England, and along with Eric Posner, the co-author of the new book, Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. And maybe we'll start, Glen, with the For a Just Society. I mean, what as you approach the writing of this book, what were the unjust elements of society that were kind of like the framework for what you wrote?
Well, I think that there's several things that are going wrong in our society. One is the fact that we have this enormous and growing inequality, so much of the wealth going to so few people who don't really make contributions that merit such a disproportional share of the social wealth. Another huge problem is the way that our economy is stagnating and people have fewer choices, less freedom, less opportunities. Today, many people feel than their parents had. And finally, maybe most importantly, our society seems to be rife with areas where minorities are being oppressed by majorities, and we don't have a really good way to resolve that problem. We sometimes have judges try to protect one group, but that ends up leading to all sorts of political dissatisfaction and conflict. So on all these levels, our society really seems to be not responding to the demands of citizens, and that's what we're trying to address here.
One of the areas maybe we can choose to dive in here is your second chapter in the book called Radical Democracy, where you talk about a system of quadratic voting, which I find super interesting. What is a sort of layman's term explanation of what quadratic voting is?
Well, the basic problem, as I mentioned, that we're trying to address is that minorities are usually protected in our current system by the will of judges, but judges aren't really democratically elected and aren't really accountable to the public. On the other hand, majority rule wouldn't really work because you think about an issue like gay marriage, that it wouldn't be fair to have everyone have exactly one vote on that issue. So the question is, how do we resolve this? Quadratic voting is a solution where every citizen would have an equal number of votes, but they wouldn't have to spend all of those votes all on just one vote per issue or per election. If an issue is more important to someone, if someone knew more about an issue, they could choose to spend more of their vote credits on that issue. And people could get a lot of votes on the issues most important, less votes on the issues less important to them. And there's this little twist, which is that because you don't want everyone to spend all their votes on the one issue that they care most about, you actually get more votes the more evenly you spread your votes. So the cost of votes in units of these credits is the square of the number of votes that you get.
So in other words, if you choose to support 4 different initiatives rather than one, you would not end up having 4 times the number of votes, but I guess would it be 16? Or I guess I'm not exactly sure I'm visualizing the math.
It depends exactly on it, but here's an example. If you have 100 credits and there are 10 issues, we actually ran a survey like this. If you put all your credits on one issue, you'd get 10 votes on that issue because 10 is the square root of 100. But if you put equal numbers of votes on all the issues, you'd get roughly 3 or 4 votes on every issue. So that's like 30 votes. So you see, by spreading things out more equally, you get almost 3 times as much total influence, but in a more diffuse way across issues.
So, in preparing for the interview, I read critiques of some of your ideas, and the one that seemed to come up often with the quadratic voting is the idea that this fundamentally violates one person, one vote, and that idea. But I know that's an issue that you address. So how do you address that issue?
Well, so the question is, what do we value about one person, one vote? Is it the rigidity that every person has to have exactly one vote on every issue? Or is it the fact that we all should be equals politically? I actually think that if it's the latter, which is what I think we should care about, then quadratic voting is actually more true to that principle. Because you think about minorities, if you're, say an African American living in the inner city in the United States, you don't have equality just because you have the same one person, one vote on every issue. You might get gerrymandered, and even beyond that, you just, you're a minority, and so you're going to lose on a whole variety of issues where majorities can rule. It's much more consistent with the principle of equality that each of us gets an equal total amount of voice, but that we can choose to concentrate that voice on issues that are most important to us so that we have greater freedom to push for the things that really matter and really affect our interests.
I'm curious whether quadratic voting and some of the other ideas in the book, which we can get into as well, in your mind, is sort of the underlying philosophy a sort of utilitarianism where you're sort of measuring outcomes, and whether we call it marginal utility to society or the economy, I don't really know, but in reading it, my thought was that there's a very utilitarian underpinning, although it's sort of like a social utilitarianism of some kind, or am I just way off?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people have that perception, and certainly utilitarianism and that sort of thinking was one way that that helped us come up with these ideas. But I wouldn't say that I'm a utilitarian or that the book relies on you being a utilitarian, because we approach things from many different perspectives. I mean, some people are utilitarians. Some people care about inequality for its own sake. Some people care about not having oppressive authorities that dominate people, but not so much about utility exactly. Our book helps advance all of those goals, and we try to argue for it from all those different perspectives. There's something in religion that's called syncretism, which is that many different people might all worship the same God, but they view different aspects of it. And this book is written very much in that spirit. We don't want to take too strong of a stand on whether it's utilitarianism or autonomy or liberty or things like this, because we believe that these ideas can help improve along all those dimensions. And we aren't going to resolve, philosophical or religious disputes in a book like this. What we're instead going to do is propose new ways of organizing our society to advance values that many of us share.
Some of the ideas seem at first glance more difficult pragmatically to even think about how they might be implemented. In your first chapter, you talk about a common ownership self-assessed tax, which we could talk about in more detail potentially. You also talk about ways of uniting the world's workers with a visa system where individuals would be able to sponsor visas for people from other countries. Which of these, I'm curious, do you think would be the most, and I know this is not your focus, but which would be the most pragmatically viable if you had to choose one where we could most approximate change the soonest Is there one?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that what I would say is it depends a lot on whether you mean implement the full extent of the proposal, or where can we make the most near-term progress in
I'd say
getting
near-term
towards a
progress.
better society. Yeah, so the data is labor chapter, in which we argue that people should be able to receive compensation for the contributions that they make to the machine learning and artificial intelligence systems of companies like Google and Facebook, rather than just having that data be taken from them, is probably the most palatable and widely appreciated of the ideas, and probably the one that will get off the ground, you know, at a broad scale the quickest.
So the idea would be all of the data, all of your activity that's taking place on platforms, which could be the Google universe, the Facebook universe, could be any of these, that you would somehow, as a contributor of your data to that ecosystem, be compensated. Along what lines? Are we talking about literally financial compensation?
Yeah, eventually, absolutely. And, you know, we imagine building what we call a data labor movement. Once people wake up, get, quote, cyber woke, to the value that their data is creating in this digital economy, and the way that the AI systems that are supposed to replace our jobs are actually based on all of our contributions, people will start demanding payment through sort of labor unions of a new modern digital sort. And fair terms of both use and compensation can be negotiated that way.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there's often the idea that, listen, Facebook ads don't work on me in the sense that I haven't ever bought anything, which let's assume that that's true, although it can sometimes be hard to figure out exactly why you did buy something at some point in your life. So I'm of no value, so I just don't really care about this. But the truth is that the algorithm with which successful targets of a product or service were targeted was data that did come from you, and thus it does have some economic value, even if you're not actually buying stuff.
Yeah, and it's not just the targeting of ads. I mean, that's what we're all familiar with today. But going forward, the greatest value these companies are going to create is not from advertising, really. Instead, it's from the artificial intelligence systems that they're training on our data, and that they'll sell to companies to automate. For example, I don't know if you saw Google's recent new assistant, the process of making reservations for someone. So they're going to automate that, and they're training all that based on our data. So people are going to be losing their jobs, and no one's going to be getting a new job, even though all that system relies on input that we put in.
The book is fascinating. It's called Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. Glenn, thanks so much for talking to me about this today.
Thanks a lot, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
In the comedy of errors that is the Trump administration, they added stupidity to bad policy at yesterday's opening of the U.S. Embassy to Israel in Jerusalem. And I don't want to talk again about the policy part, because I did that yesterday. I've done it many times before. Moving the embassy to from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, terrible idea politically. You all know I feel that way, and we've talked about why many times. What I want to talk about today is the ignorance of having an evangelical Christian pastor who says Hitler was sent by God to speak at the opening of this embassy in Jerusalem, in Israel. And I'm talking about Robert Jeffress from one of these huge megachurches, this one in Dallas, Texas. And I've mentioned Robert Jeffress before. I first mentioned him to you in 2011 when I told you that he was opposed to Mitt Romney based on Mitt Romney being a Mormon, which wasn't that crazy except for the alternative that he thought was the correct one when it comes to religion and government. Then in 2012, Robert Jeffress said that Obama's re-election would lead to the reign of the Antichrist. And I don't know if he meant Trump eventually in 2016, but it's not exactly clear what he meant. I don't know that it happened. And then just last year, I told you about Jeffress saying that Donald Trump has God's authority to take out Kim Jong-un. So that's his backstory. Jeffress gets invited to speak at the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. And he's previously said that Jews will suffer for eternity in hell. In other words, there's no redemption for Jews. Hell forever is their one path. You cannot be saved by being a Jew in the world of Robert Jeffress. Another speaker at this event is John Hagee from Christians United for Israel. And as united for Israel as they may be, Hagee has previously said that Hitler was fulfilling God's will by aiding the Jews in their desire to return to Israel by killing 6 million of them in the Holocaust. And that's actually not that rare for Christians in general. There's lots of them that believe both that Jews are going to hell and that Hitler did a good thing because he brought about the circumstances which led to the creation of the state of Israel, which they believe will lead to the second coming of Christ. So it's a very self-centered and greedy reason why, but they do often say that Israel's a good thing for that reason.
I was under the impression that most evangelicals nowadays are on board with Judaism. Like, they'll call Jews the chosen people, and they get a VIP entrance into heaven, and they talk all the time about Judeo-Christian values. But apparently not Jeffress.
They're not on board with Jews. They're on board with supporting Israel because it will bring back their Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So it's all framed as we must support Israel. Blah, blah. It's because they want Jesus to come back. That's really the reason why.
And then everyone dies in the rapture. That's good for everyone,
but they get saved or something like that. This is one of those issues where at every conceivable level, the Trump administration is just perpetuating this endless gong show of bad policy with general incompetence. And I've said before that the slogan for the Trump administration should be solutions that don't work for problems that don't exist. I'd now propose an alternative slogan: bad policy and general incompetence, as an overall slogan for what we're seeing.
I think those are our next 2 T-shirt designs.
Yeah,
Write those down.
Meanwhile, not at all shocking, the death toll continues to rise. Now more than 60 killed in the Gaza Strip, plentiful tear gas. Hamas again reinvigorated, not that you need to do much to reinvigorate their desire for Israel's destruction, and there's simply no way in which this goes well or helps the cause for Israeli-Palestinian peace. There's no way at all. This continues, this movement to the, I'm getting back into the policy, which I said I wasn't going to do, this movement of the embassy again is going to become a further impediment to any realistic peace talks for a 2-state solution. It's disgusting, it's vile, and by the way, Netanyahu's got to go, but I'm sure we'll have time to revisit that. The Supreme Court has made the major decision to allow sports betting in New Jersey at casinos and racetracks, which effectively ends the federal restriction on sports betting, which has existed with some exemptions everywhere outside the state of Nevada. Right now, Nevada, Delaware, Oregon, and Montana are exempt from a federal law called PASPA, P-A-S-P-A for short, because they were grandfathered in before PASPA banned 46 states from having legal betting on sports. And what the Supreme Court has effectively said is not that sports betting must be legal by default in all states, but rather it's not illegal by default by federal decree. In other words, if states want to restrict gambling on sports, they can do it, but they need to do it through legislation. If Congress federally wants to regulate betting on sports, they can do it if they want to, but it is not by default banned. And there are now 25 states that could be looking for allowances and the legalization of betting on sports. The case in question is Murphy versus the NCAA, which is in practice a federal rights versus states' rights case. It's about whether the federal government can commandeer the regulatory power of the states. And this is, to take a phrase out of Donald Trump's playbook, it's a Chris Christie beauty, because this all started years ago when Chris Christie was governor in New Jersey. New Jersey passed a non-binding referendum saying sports betting is okay in 2011. Third Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the law. They said that it violates the federal PASPA law, was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has spoken. And sports leagues are concerned, understandably, about more sports fixing or point shaving, all the lovely stuff that sports betting has sometimes brought in the past. So immediate impacts are, number one, we're going to see a bunch of states move to legalize sports betting. We'll probably see more sports betting commercials on television, but this does not mean that sports betting is just going to be legal everywhere, right, including online. States are going to want to control it. States are going to want to the extent that they can, prevent online gambling on sports. They're going to want to regulate it at physical locations and oversee, and most importantly, tax the gambling on sports that's going on. So, you know, I've talked before, I believe that, like with the war on drugs, when you bring something out of the black market, people bet on sports anyway, even if it's illegal. That can be very good if you are able to gain revenues through the taxation of that and reinvest some of those revenues into trying to discourage the activity, particularly problem gambling in this case. So in general, I'm for the legalization and the attempt to sort of deflate black markets. We do have to consider the ways in which sports betting might impact some of the ways that the sports industry itself could be affected, whether it's fixing, shaving, all of that stuff. But that stuff could happen anyway, and there are penalties for that stuff. So I'm actually not that worried about that angle. I'm more worried about the angle of creating even more gambling addicts.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as a win just for the sake of consistency. Like, why is it that Nevada for all these years was able to get away with having legalized gambling and these other states couldn't? It was always a bit sketchy to me.
Sure.
And especially when you saw the emergence of those fantasy sports websites like FanDuel and DraftKings.
Yeah.
They were able to get through via some loophole. It never really seemed to make sense.
Yeah, my major concern really is that this is just more commercialization of sports and even more of a departure of sports from the sort of community and social aspects that it was once focused on and one to more betting. Like, it sounds kind of old-fashioned, but that is one of the things that I do like about sports, which is that this is something different than just making financial bets. And the libertarians will say, David, the government's not your babysitter. They're not supposed to prevent you from gambling if that's what you want to do. Well, the government can make decisions based on the societal impact of an activity. They've decided that, for example, cigarettes will be highly taxed because they have huge, in part, negative externalities and secondhand impacts and whatever. And so cigarettes are taxed very highly to dissuade people from using cigarettes. I think this is not a legal question. I think the government absolutely has the right to regulate legal gambling. And for me, it's more an issue of the societal impact. Let's go to your voicemail, 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's another voicemail asking me about why do I have a problem with religious financial guy Dave Ramsey?
Hey, David. It's Bertney from New Jersey. Just wanted to ask another Dave Ramsey question. I don't understand why. I understand the fact that he's religious and that he weaves religion into the advice that he gives financially. But if that financial advice works, I don't see what's the problem with it whatsoever. I mean, you call him mediocre. You call him basically, he says he has mediocre financial advice. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it seems to work pretty well, regardless of what it is, especially since in your response on YouTube was you don't take advice really much from many people. So how do you not like his financial advice if you don't really have a standing for it, or at least logic behind it?
Listen, just because I don't take Dave Ramsey's financial advice doesn't mean I'm not aware of a lot of the things that he says. So a few things that I disagree with Dave Ramsey on and I think are bad advice. Paying off all debt immediately or as quickly as possible isn't always the solution, number one. Number two, he often uses a 12% annual return for calculating future cash flows and the value of investments. No serious financial advisor will tell you to plan for 12% or anything close to it. Typically, you want to use the number 8. If you want to be conservative, you want to use the number 7% for annual growth of investments. He talks about spending 8% a year as a safe withdrawal rate during retirement. That's insanely aggressive. Historically, 9% of individuals will get 30 years out of their money if they withdraw 8% a year. It's way too risky for most retirees. Very, very bad idea. He pushes actively managed mutual funds. Absolute disaster. One of the most profitable mechanisms for the financial industry. You want low-cost, passively managed funds, period. Again, if he doesn't stand by that anymore, then maybe I agree with him now. He's recommended financial advisors in the past. I don't want to say their name, but he's recommended advisors from a company that are paid commissions, which is the worst incentive structure for getting good financial advice to people, period. I've also heard him say eliminate all debt before investing. Often that's not the right way forward. If you've got a mortgage at 3.5% and you can get a match on your 401k from your employer, which can be expected to earn 7 or 8% a year over time, the interest on your mortgage is also tax deductible. Why wouldn't you start investing in the 401k, expected to make 7 or 8%, plus the matching from your employer, which is effectively free money, and take the tax deduction on the mortgage rather than just saving 3.5% by paying down the mortgage? So he's filled with bad advice. He also presents it without having to defend it because some people treat his advice as, again, I know he's a religious guy, as gospel. So those are a few things about Dave Ramsey that I don't agree with. If he's changed his views, let me know. We've got a great bonus show for you today. DavidPakman.com. Sorry, no. JoinPakman.com is the new website to sign up.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.